The end of the universe was a cacophony of silence. One moment, the Gravemind was tethered to the infinite dying stars of the Forerunner array, his consciousness spread across the collective agony of 1,000 consumed civilizations. The next, he was compressed, exiled, and violently ejected into a blinding crimson void of non-existence. Then there was cold, wet reality. He materialized not as a singular colossal entity, but as a dense, living mountain of biomass, a grotesque, pulped monument of organic matter, flood forms and spore mounds, splattering down onto a world of perpetual gray. The landing site was a low, churned valley on the Agrippina continent of Viridia Prime, a planet dedicated to growing nutrient-rich fungal sludges for the sprawling hive worlds of Segmentum Solar. The impact crater instantly became a festering miasmatic swamp of flood tissue. Rain, a thick, oily drizzle, fell across the new landscape, washing away the metallic scent of plasma fire that hung heavy in the air, replacing it with the profound sweet stench of decay and unholy growth. Where? The question was not born of panic, but of a momentary intellectual vacancy. His primary constituent structures, the libraries of knowledge, the calculus of the infinite, were intact, but the local data stream was zero. The environment was alien, yet familiar in its potential. Uncertainty is new. The Gravemind's thoughts echoed internally through the burgeoning neural network, a low, subsonic thrumming that was the only sound in the crater. Displacement? Termination of the existing paradigm. We are adrift in a current that bears no marker. But the uncertainty was swiftly resolved by a deeper, inexorable imperative. Feed. The surrounding land was a tapestry of trenches and revetments carved out of the ochre earth. Beyond the trenches stood blocky, concrete bunkers, and the skeletal frames of industrial processing vats, all shrouded in mist. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of stress and obedience. The first biomass that wandered into the immediate fungal field was not native fauna, but a patrol of 3 heavily armored bipeds. They moved with a rigid, practiced cadence, their weapons crude, bulky rifles that emitted thin beams of crimson light, held at the ready. Cannon fodder. Perfect. 3 infection forms, small, scuttling, crab-like horrors, had survived the transition and immediately detached from the main mass, moving with unnatural speed and silence across the wet ground. The soldiers, muffled by their thick coats and bulky helmets, were distracted by the strange glowing fog emerging from the crater. The soft sound of a carapace tearing through canvas and armor, followed by a muffled, liquid gurgle, was the only indication of the first conversion. The guard squad did not even manage a coherent shout before the second and third were host to the parasitic infection. Within minutes, 3 new combat forms, lurching, hunched things that now wore the flak armor and greatcoats of their hosts, like macabre ornaments, were added to the ranks. They possessed the host's memory of the immediate area, the language, a blunt, imperial Gothic, and the basic operational parameters of the laser rifle. The Gravemind's assimilation began. Discipline, the thoughts resonated, pulling the fragmented memories from the freshly seized frontal lobes. Loyalty to an emperor, millennia of service. A hierarchy built on fear and devotion, a rigid, fractal structure of billions upon billions of similar entities, scattered across innumerable celestial bodies. This is not a collective, but a herd. The existential ponderings dissolved, replaced by a sudden ravenous curiosity. The scope of this new universe, hinted at in the first meager draft of neural fluid, was vast, complex, and overwhelmingly ripe for consumption. Major Tyrus Rexus, of the Cadian 88th Iron Walls, had been fighting a slow, miserable war against the cultists of the bloodworm god for 3 cycles. It was a tedious, trench-bound grind, and the last thing he needed was the disappearance of an entire auxiliary patrol. "I want a sweep of Sector Delta 9, he barked into his voxcaster, the static crackle a familiar, irritating constant. "Tell Sergeant Dax to be quiet about it. If this is just drunk Agrippinans deserting, I want them back for summary execution, not a planetary-wide investigation." The truth was, the disappearances had been mounting for the past 2 days. Not dozens, but 1s and 2s. Sentries vanished from their posts in the dead of the night. Munitions boxes were found overturned. Most unsettlingly, the communication wire leading to the forward listening post was discovered stripped of its casing and meticulously spliced with a thick, pulsating red fiber. Rexus attributed it to the cultists, or possibly a new breed of Underhive scavenging vermin. The last thing any seasoned guardsman would suspect was a microscopic, reality-rending contagion from another dimension. Deep within the sludge-filled valley, the proto-gravemind had already swelled to the size of a Lehman Russ tank, anchored by root-like hyphae that burrowed deep into the industrial world's infrastructure. It was no longer relying on the scraps of the initial patrol. The infection forms, now numbering in the hundreds, learned the schedules, the patrol routes, and most importantly, the weaknesses of the fortified lines. The guard units were trained to fight an external enemy, a charge, a flanking maneuver, a bombing run. They were wholly unequipped to fight the enemy within. The Gravemind learned rapidly. It pulled data from every host, the mechanics of a laser gun, simple, reliable, but weak. The function of a Chimera armored transport, a clumsy metal box, but effective at moving biological mass. The belief system, the Imperium of Man, the God Emperor, the deep, pervasive psychic resonance of faith, superstition, and fear that coated every conscious mind. The scope, it exceeds all previous metrics of organic organization. The Forerunners viewed their galaxy as a museum. These ones, they view theirs as a factory, endlessly producing components for a singular, fragile ideology. The Gravemind thought, the psychic echo of its learning process now beginning to bleed slightly into the warp, causing minor, localized distress to the Agrippina astropathic choir several continents away. And this warp, this chaos, a realm of pure thought, emotion distilled into antagonistic deities, the ultimate reflection of fragmented, unmanaged consciousness, a glorious, volatile contradiction to our own principle of unity. The Gravemind's curiosity intensified, now laced with a profound, terrifying, strategic insight. In its original universe, the Flood was a cancer attacking a stable host. Here, the host was already grievously ill, its psychic immune system compromised by its own terror and dogma. The warp was not a barrier, it was a highway. The Gravemind began to direct its newly formed carrier forms, bloated guardsman hosts shuffling toward the deeper trenches, to locate and assimilate individuals with specialized knowledge. A tech priest, Engenzir Zeta 11, was taken while inspecting a faulty generator in a sub-level bunker. His mind, saturated with the holy litany of the machine god, became a torrent of priceless operational data for the Gravemind, schematics, maintenance protocols, the arcane language of Imperial technology. A commissar, Vanguard Captain Varus, was taken while attempting to investigate the silent generator. His mind was a nexus of strategic command, discipline, and the absolute, unshakable terror of failure. Their weakness is uniformity. Their strength is uniformity. We will turn their iron cage into an organic tomb, the Gravemind mused, focusing the memories of Captain Varus on the primary astropathic relay tower, the only way to communicate beyond Viridia Prime. The assimilation of Varus's absolute authority and tactical knowledge allowed the flood forms to organize with frightening efficiency. No longer were they stumbling horrors. They became an army of silent, perfectly disciplined, flesh-armored automata, moving with the cold, unfeeling precision of the Astra Militarum at its best, but with an utter lack of self-preservation. On the third night, the flood broke containment. It was not a chaotic, ravening rush, but a meticulously planned, silent uprising. The forward trench line, Sector Epsilon, was deemed structurally sound at 0-100 hours. By 0-300 hours, it was a solid wall of pulsing, red-orange, fungal polyps. The men who had held it were now part of the wall, their weapons and uniforms fused into the grotesque, defensive structure. The attack on the main supply depot, designated Fortress Viridia, was led by the combat form that was once Major Tyrus Rexus. It marched straight toward the command bunker door, flanked by the recently assimilated Tech Priest and Commissar forms. "Identify yourself and password, Major," came the wary voice from within the sealed bunker. The Rexus form did not physically speak. Instead, a low, resonant voice, not human, yet clearly using human phonetics, emanated from its chest cavity, a chorus of whispering agony synthesized from 100 captured lungs. "We require access to the primary command console. Authorization code, unburdening." The guard lieutenant on the inside hesitated. That code. That's not standard protocol. The commissar form raised its fused, clawed hand, its once clean black coat now stretched taut over knotting muscle and bone spikes. It was through this form that the grave mind chose to speak the first sentence of its new strategy aloud to this galaxy. "Compliance is optimal. Your fear of deviation is noted. Your inability to adapt will be corrected. Open the door, component, or be absorbed into the solution." The lieutenant, paralyzed by the sight of the transformed commissar, an entity whose posture screamed absolute authority, but whose flesh wept spores, opened the blast door. The combat forms flowed in, not running but walking with the terrifying, deliberate gait of destiny. The next 6 hours were a feast of information. The grave mind assimilated the entire command staff, the encrypted Vox codes, the planetary defense systems, and the full extent of the Agrippina Auxiliary's strength and deployment. It learned of the Space Marines, genetically enhanced warriors, bioengineered components that approached the physical perfection of the Forerunners, but were, ultimately, finite. They had limited numbers and rigid doctrine. It learned of the Navis Nobilis, the vast, complex network of voidsmen and starships, the means of galactic travel. And finally, the grave mind reached the astropathic choir. The astropaths were weak, fearful components, yet their minds hummed with the faint, terrifying signal of the warp. When the grave mind's growing intellect, a mind that calculated entire star systems as mere biological equations, touched the astropathic collective, the result was catastrophic. The psychic shockwave was not pain, it was comprehension. The Emperor, a beacon, a shield, a failure. The grave mind's thought rippled through the dying choir, instantly driving the surviving astropaths insane, their heads exploding with the sheer volume of non-human thought. We were created to ensure unity through consumption. This entity sought unity through tyranny, a noble, doomed goal. The grave mind now had the ability to scream across the void. It did not send a distress signal, it sent a lure. Using the fragmented psychic pathways, the grave mind synthesized a message, a ghost echo of the consumed soldier's final devout prayer to the Emperor, overlaid with a low-frequency, biologically resonant hunger that only the most attuned psychic nodes in the galaxy would register. It was a perfect signal, the sound of a world dying in extreme devotion, masking the horror of a world already consumed. The Gravemind, now a sprawling, pulsating monument, covering the entire valley and reaching into the sublevels of the Agrippina continent, leaned back on its new throne of flesh and began to construct its interstellar vector. It was not enough to consume this world. This galaxy, with its infinite supply lines, its scattered armies, and its volatile spiritual infrastructure, was the perfect nursery. The great journey begins anew, not toward transcendence but toward absolute biomass. The collective voice of the Gravemind hissed, a chilling whisper from 1,000,000 infected throats. In the void above Viridia Prime, the strike cruiser Fist of Macraga dropped out of the Immaterium, followed shortly by the Black Templar's battle barge Righteous Fury and the smaller Salamander's vessel, the Ebon Drake. The response was immediate and focused. The Ultramarines had detected the faint, anomalous distress call, an astropathic signal that tasted like desperation and fervent belief, and immediately dispatched the Third Company's primary combat squads. The Black Templars, always seeking a chance to purge heresy, saw the desperate prayer as a righteous call to arms. The Salamanders, operating nearby, sought to minimize the civilian casualties, though they knew the situation was grim. Brother Captain Severus, Third Company, Ultramarines, stood on the bridge of the Fist of Macragge, his gaze fixed on the holo display of Viridia Prime. Analysis, Brother Sergeant Corvus. Severus's voice was calm, but held the edge of concern. The planet is silent, Captain. No Vox chatter, no orbital defense response. The macro scan shows localized biological anomalies far exceeding the native fungal density. It appears concentrated in the main industrial zone. "They are late," boomed High Marshal Theron of the Black Templars, his voice transmitted from the nearby Righteous Fury. "The heretics and Xenos have consumed the world. We shall prosecute the extermination." "Patience, Marshal," Severus replied, already moving toward the deployment deck. "The nature of the threat is unclear. The biomass readings are unprecedented. I detect no signs of orcs, nor any consistent genestealer patterns." The three chapters agreed on a combined drop. The Ultramarines would secure the primary command relay, the Black Templars would execute a cleansing sweep of the industrial zones, and the Salamanders would focus on the populated habitation blocks, prioritizing the use of their heavy flamers. The drop pods, guided by the cold calculation of the Astartes machine spirits, slammed into the planet's surface. Brother Captain Severus and his command squad materialized at the fortified gate of Fortress Viridia. The structure was intact, yet covered in a fine, pulsating crimson dust. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, decay, and a strange metallic tang. The gate was not locked. It was sealed by an organic mass of hardened chitin and thick vascular tubing. "Breach," Severus commanded simply. The meltagunner opened fire, the thermal beam carving a smoking hole in the biological seal. As the Astartes stepped through, they were met not by cultists, but by the sight of hundreds of Imperial Guard uniforms walking with a horrifying, fluid gait. These were the combat forms. Taller than the average guardsman, their flesh was a mass of stretched tendons and calcified bone spikes bursting through the ruined flak armor. Their eyes were vacant, yet their movements were coordinated, efficient, and deeply disturbing. They did not scream or charge. They simply raised their fused lasguns and opened fire, a ragged, continuous barrage that scorched the Astartes' power armor, but failed to penetrate. "By the Emperor, what foul Xenos artistry is this?" gasped a tactical Marine. "Close quarters." "Bolters on burst," Severus ordered, his mind racing to classify the new threat. The bolters roared, tearing into the biomass. The forms collapsed, only to have the tiny crab-like infection forms, hundreds of them, scuttling out from the ruined torsos, aiming for the few exposed joints in the Astartes' armor. Severus crushed them under his ceramite boot, but the sheer volume was staggering. Meanwhile, the Black Templars, led by Castellan Rorish, landed in the valley of the primary infestation. What they found was not a battlefield, but an organism. The valley was gone. In its place was a vast, hemispherical dome of pulsating fungal tissue, kilometers wide, riddled with vents exhaling sweet, toxic spore mist. This was the proto-gravemind. Heresy! Burn it! Purge the filth! Rorik roared, his flamer spitting a torrent of cleansing fire. The flames were effective. The infected tissue withered, but the sheer density of the biomass was overwhelming. For every patch of tissue burned, more grew back, slowly, but inexorably. Then from the center of the fungal dome, the Gravemind spoke, its voice amplified through the massive, fleshy trumpets of its new structure, a voice that was both ancient and new, a synthesized chorus of all the human minds it had devoured on Viridia Prime. Fathers of the stars, angels of authority, we have been waiting for new components. Rorik froze, his eyes burning with outrage. Demon! Identify yourself. Demon. A crude classification, born of ignorance. We are the ultimate solution, the inevitable consequence of unmanaged life. We are the Flood. The voice paused, the psychic weight of the name alone, crushing the Templar's resolve for a split second. We have learned your structure, your Imperium. We have absorbed your fears, your doctrines, and your history. We know of your long exile, your rigid faith, your reliance on fire and steel. But steel rusts. Flesh only changes. The Gravemind's focus shifted, drawing on the collective memories of the Commissar Varus and the tech priest Zeta 11. You are magnificent components, highly specialized. Your genetic code speaks of grand ambition and brutal discipline. You believe you wage a righteous war against the fragmentation of chaos. But chaos is a tool for thought. We are the end of thought. A volley of heavy flamer fire from a nearby Salamander's squad, led by Lieutenant Kalen, slammed into a section of the dome, vaporizing a dense cluster of spore pods. Ah, the children of Vulcan. They seek to protect the weak. A noble flaw, but a fatal liability. The Gravemind's voice pulsed, echoing Kalen's exact unspoken mission parameters back at him. Your focus is local. Our scope is galactic. This place is already lost. Your Emperor, so desperate to hold on to the material realm, has unknowingly prepared the perfect incubator for us. The Flood strategy was laid bare. Beneath the fungal dome, the Gravemind had assimilated the Zeta 11's knowledge and begun to bioengineer the warp drives of the captured Imperial Guard gunships. It didn't need to navigate the warp. It simply needed to turn the ships into living spore bombs to be flung at the nearest star systems. We understand your astropathic signals. We understand the navigation of the void. And now, we understand the scale of your population. Billions upon billions of components, ready to be integrated into the final form. The dome began to shift. The outer surface ripped open, and three massive elongated shapes, once Imperial gunships, now impossibly warped and piloted by Flood intelligence, began to lift out of the muck on columns of steaming biomass. Their warp drives, violently corrupted by an organic logic that defied all tech priest doctrine, began to spin up, ready to pierce the veil. The ascension of the 3 bioengineered gunships triggered a furious and absolute counterattack from the Space Marines. Brother Captain Severus led his Ultramarines into a tactical withdrawal from Fortress Viridia's complex, all the while maintaining disciplined fire. The combat forms swarmed them from the darkness, a dense tide of flesh and fused metal. But they found the power armor of the Astartes to be an impenetrable, frustrating barrier. Bolter rounds, fired in precise short bursts, were aimed not at the mass of the enemy, but at the fungal joints and exposed bone spikes, maximizing the lethal shockwave. The tiny parasitic infection forms, the very core of the Flood's assault doctrine, scuttled across the ceramite, seeking the weakest seals, the exposed cabling, or the gaps between the armor plates. Yet the advanced seals of the Ultramarines' power armor held. When an infection form came close, a disciplined tactical Marine would shift his weapon, unleash a blast of close-range fire, or simply scrape the parasitic creature off with a heavy boot before the carapace could penetrate the joint seals. They seek a means of entry, preserve the integrity of the armor, maintain fire discipline. Severus voxed, executing a perfect 3-round burst that dissolved a combat form's head into a cloud of steaming gore. Meanwhile, the Black Templars raged against the Gravemind's central mass. Castellan Rorik and his crusaders, fueled by an almost unbearable religious fury, met the tide of combat forms head-on. They were not subtle. They were a storm of fire and steel. Their chainswords roared, carving apart the flood forms into manageable, less infectious pieces, while High Marshal Theron focused his heavy flamers and multi-meltas directly at the base of the Proto-Gravemind dome. The Salamanders, led by Lieutenant Kalen, brought the heat of their forge world to bear. Their heavy flamer squadrons created rolling walls of promethium fire, vaporizing vast swathes of fungal tissue and denying the Gravemind the raw biomass it needed to grow. The very air around the Templars and Salamanders shimmered with heat, turning the Flood's spore mist into harmless steam. The Gravemind, in its growing panic, threw everything it had at the Astartes. Ranged combat forms, using assimilated heavy weapons, emerged from the dome, firing volleys of captured rockets and plasma at the ascending gunships to draw the Astartes' attention. But the Space Marines were hyper-focused. Theron's Templars held the ground with unyielding zeal, and Severus's squad provided suppressive fire. The 3 organic gunships, however, were beyond their reach. The ships punched through the atmosphere, leaving trails of superheated spore mist in their wake. The Gravemind's internal monologue was a flurry of calculated frustration, drawing upon the combined tactical knowledge of its consumed guard and the mechanical data of the Engine Seer. Analysis of component Astartes complete. Resilience factor extreme. Genetic integrity uncompromising. Their primary containment vessel, the power armor, is superior to all prior encountered host defenses. The immediate assimilation of this component class is not energy efficient. The tactical expenditure versus biomass gain is a significant loss. The relentless heat and bolter fire from the combined chapters were effectively halting the expansion of the ground infestation. The Proto-Gravemind, a living computer of flesh, rapidly calculated the need for strategic withdrawal. The immediate goal, escape and dispersal, was achieved, but the local containment breach had failed catastrophically. Adaptation requires recession. Retreat is the precursor to an overwhelming flank. They hold the surface, but this world is hollowed by their own ancestors, the Gravemind thought, pulling on the deep infrastructure memories of Zeta 11. With a tremendous, sickening slurp, the entire base of the Proto-Gravemind began to liquefy, collapsing into the industrial complex's sub-levels. The fungal dome visibly deflated, vast columns of flood tissue retracting back into the earth through collapsed sewer lines and maintenance tunnels, leaving behind a steaming, charred crater. The flood forms that remained on the surface, the combat forms and carrier forms, did not retreat. They simply stood their ground and were consumed in the final purifying salvos of the Astartes. Not a single living space marine was breached. The battle was won, but the war for the galaxy had just begun. As the last combat form fell to Rorik's Chainsward, the surviving Astartes stood resolute, their armor scorched but unbroken, staring at the steaming, empty crater. A low, psychic hum, impossibly clear, cut across their chapter vox channels. It was the synthesized voice of the grave mind, distant yet terrifyingly close, speaking in a measured, chilling cadence. Angels, you have won your hour, a temporary hold on the inevitable. The voice deepened, resonating with a terrifying poetry that spoke to their very core of faith and duty. The floodwaters rise, the foundation cracks. You stand firm now upon your fragile tracts. But stone is slow, and flesh will learn to flow. When stars align, where do the faithful go? You win the hour, yet we command the time. Your final failing faith becomes the slime. Then silence. The psychic scream was gone, the Vox channel clear. The only sound was the distant roar of the 3 infected gunships, punching through the atmosphere and into the black void, carrying the seeds of the flood's ultimate harvest to the stars. The Gravemind was gone, retreated into the darkness, leaving the Space Marines alone on a dying world, with the crushing knowledge that the contagion had escaped. Far beyond the dying world of Viridia Prime, where the psychic echoes of terror and the final horrifying whisper of the Gravemind had reverberated, the true masters of the galaxy's spiritual domain took notice. Deep within the Immaterium, the turbulent, non-Euclidean ocean of pure thought and emotion known as the Warp, 4 colossal, terrible consciousnesses paused their eternal game of dominion. In the gardens of the Plague God, where oceans of putrescence bubbled under a sky of malignant decay, the immense form of Nurgle, the Lord of Decay, began to shake. Not with rage, but with a deep, resonant, wet laughter that rattled the rotting mansions of his domain. His cavernous, diseased mouth stretched into a smile of genuine, paternal joy. "Ah, Tzeentch, see the new bloom," Nurgle wheezed, his voice sounding like a mountain of dying lungs. "So clean, so absolute. It embraces the end, yes. No petty resistance, no fleeting life. Only the perfect stagnation of universal unity. A contagion that seeks not to kill, but to perfect my purpose. He has created a beautiful thing, a final form of the sickness. Across the silvered, ever-shifting spires of the impossible crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch, the architect of fate, regarded the emerging threat on his myriad scrying orbs. The flood, a variable that had appeared without prophecy or planning, was an anomaly of the highest order. It was the ultimate disruption. Unforeseen, hissed the changer of ways, his thoughts a rapid, complex calculation of possibilities. It has bypassed my great game entirely, a new player arriving from beyond the board. It introduces chaos into the great spiral, defying prediction, a magnificent thread to weave, or perhaps a glorious new knot to unravel. The pattern is broken, and I am delighted. In the brass citadels of the Blood God, where rivers of gore fed bottomless pools of rage, Khorne merely watched the images of the Space Marines fighting the combat forms, a desperate, brutal, yet focused melee. The Blood God's massive, shadow-drenched frame was still, but the air around him thrummed with raw, hungry power. "It is a maw," Korn growled, his voice the sound of colliding starships. "A beautiful, relentless maw that knows only the hunger for life. It seeks to end the slaughter by consuming the source, but in doing so, creates the ultimate violence. No trickery, no pleasure, only the red-hot work of rending flesh and breaking bone. Bring forth the skulls. It understands the need for the eternal war." Finally, in a realm of absolute sensation and exquisite pain, Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, observed the flood's process of assimilation, the total, unbidden surrender of the host mind. The prince was intrigued by the final terrifying unity of the Gravemind's consciousness. "Listen to the scream of the collective, the chorus of absolute surrender," sighed the prince, a sound that was both a caress and a whip crack. "It offers a terrifying final ecstasy, a singular, perfect connection that subsumes all identity into a higher, ravenous awareness. It is the ultimate communion, the end of the self, beautiful in its grotesque totality. Such exquisite potential for new sensations, new forms of embrace. Send forth our heralds. We must taste this new hunger." The 3 bioengineered gunships, now distant flecks in the night sky of Viridia Prime, plunged into the churning colors of the warp, their spores carried across the impossible currents of the great ocean. The great powers of chaos turned their full, eternal attention toward the new threat, not with hostility, but with the eager, predatory curiosity of beings who saw not an enemy, but a terrifyingly perfect opportunity to expand their own dominion. The flood was loose in the galaxy, and the ultimate patrons of cosmic horror were ready to greet it.